And this shouldn't be a surprise to any of you in terms of, this is the way we've organized our work in communities, which, as I say, is antithetical to getting to the point of making the same movie. And you all know this, is that top line are all the different kind of resources that we plow into communities to do their work, whether they're coming from local community-based, United Ways, community foundations, senior donors, federal funding. We were talking about SNAP dollars, and you can't call it SNAP here, it's food stamp, because the state has different requirements than federal requirement, municipal and regional funding, all those different kinds of mechanisms. Do those funding sources ever talk to each other? Rarely do those funding sources ever have the same kind of picture in mind. And it gets so bad as how many here are executive directors of some agency? So a number of you, is that you and many times have to keep your books one way for one funder that says our year starts January 1st. Another funder says, no, we want you to keep your books because our year starts September 1st or October 1st. So, but it gets even worse than that. If you were going to do, I mentioned Battle Creek, Michigan about teen pregnancy. If you were going to do a Google search and put in teen pregnancy, and go ahead and go home and do this afternoon, teen pregnancy and philanthropy or funding or resources, you'll find 7 different definitions of a teenager. So what we've got now is we've got funders defining themselves by the fragment as opposed to the result. Underneath that, that level is at the community. All the different agencies, organizations, governmental departments, corner clinics, whatever that is, that are in some way trying to articulate why they need some of those resources coming. And so we've put those agencies or those programs or those activities in an untenable situation of having to collaborate, like we're talking about today, but also compete. Is one of you is going to be better off than another of you if you beat the other person to a grant. So talk about creating a system that makes it almost impossible for talking about making that same movie, is that in many ways we reward you for holding your cards to yourself. But the worst part about this, I think the part that's so intractable, is look where the community is. The community is very much in the shadow of that exchanging of dollars or ideas between the funders and the agencies and the organizations and the governmental departments. And I'll give you one example of how perverse this gets, and I'm sure you could all come up to your own examples. But when I was working in Southeast Michigan in the mid-1990s, and they used this term, if you were a dysfunctional family in the state of Michigan, it would be likely that you would be interviewed 7 or 8 times in a calendar year. Now, if you weren't dysfunctional at the beginning of that year, you were probably by the end. And did those interviews have any case management strategy implications? No. Those interviews were so you as an agency or an organization or a government department could claim that family so you could get funding. So we actually created a funding mechanism that is antithetical to the very outcome that we're trying to achieve. So much of the work that we've seen in those communities that have been successful in achieving outcomes, I think that's at the opportunity for this advisory group, is how do we flip that pyramid so the community is at the top? What you're trying to accomplish drives your decisions, not the way we've organized this fragmented sense of work. Because that's all that pyramid is trying to organize fragments. And what a community thrives on is holistic solutions. So think about, as an advisory team, how do you put that community at the top of that pyramid? The worst part about this is how deceptive it is in terms of taking good people doing good things. There's no malicious player in this. But how do we take good people doing good things and not getting to good results? Let's see the next slide. This is the early childhood system in Rochester, Minnesota, about 2003. This is a very well-to-do community. If you know, Rochester, Minnesota is where the Mayo Clinic's located. So it had a lot of money, but had a very urban, low income, high free and reduced lunch population in their schools. And so they were willing to invest almost whatever it took to get their children ready for school. And they had this slide, or else actually we helped them develop this slide, and they wanted to put actually more money into that system. And they had about another $1.5 million annually that they wanted to spend. And in essence, what they were asking us, Jay, where should we put the next arrow? The question is that if you put that community outcome at the top, if your goal was have every child walk through that kindergarten door ready to learn, would you create a system that looked like that? That's a system created by good people doing good things. Every single box there represents a state-of-the-art program or activity. But they were only getting a third of their children ready for kindergarten with best practice, state-of-the-art boxes. The question had to be, what is the outcome that we're trying to do? So today, Rochester is in the area of getting 80% of their children ready for kindergarten at fewer constant dollars than they were spending in 2003. Because so many of our dollars are going into those arrows. So many of our dollars are going into the competition across boxes versus that clarity of the outcome. So one of the challenges, I think, for this advisory committee is how do we understand what movie we're making? Because I've heard a lot of powerful resources that were in this room. But how do we all align in terms of saying, given those powerful resources, from artists to nutritionists to council folks to the health departments, how do we get them in all the same place so that that end result is what? And that, I think, is a question that should be in front of the advisory group, is that then allows you to put that community at that top of the pyramid. If you don't have a shared sense of the answer to what, you won't know how you can get that community to be the driving force of how your work aligns. I'm going to give you just one example of how getting that community fully engaged, and I'm talking going well beyond the folks that are here in the fire station this morning. And this is from Dane County, Wisconsin. Many of you are aware of the huge achievement gap between African American and white children within our schools across the U.S. And for the last 10 years, we've been spending millions and millions of dollars, I should say, trying to solve that gap. The only one community that I know achieved that, and if you were looking at 2006 and 2010 numbers, it would be Dane County, Wisconsin, in terms of completely eliminating that gap. And the way they did that is they went fully out to the community itself. It wasn't just a collaboration among the schools. It wasn't just a collaboration among the schools and the businesses. It was a collaboration across the community to say, how do we get all of our children successful? And they closed that gap not on the fact that some children's performance went down, but on all of children's performance going up, some going up at a faster slope than others to be able to close that gap. So again, it's an example that the traditional way, the way that the funding in many ways came to schools to close that gap, was very much programmatic, activity-driven, until Dane County looked at it and said, no, it has to be outcome, community-owned to be able to accomplish it. So the one school that is, or one system, if you will, that's been able to close that gap across multiple school districts is that system that moved it out to the community. Now, real quickly for this group, just a few, and I'm not going to go through this all together, but as your role as advisors, I want you to understand that there really are two dramatic types of leaderships that we see in communities. The leadership model on the left is the model that if you went into the Barnes & Noble and went into leadership, 99% of the books would be about that model of leadership, the hierarchical organization model of leadership. The type of leadership that we're asking of the advisory group is really that model on the right, that really there isn't a lot of research or experience about it. It really almost becomes a learned behavior. But just to talk a couple of the differences between the two. The organizational model becomes that hierarchical. I, as that organization, own the product, the result. So a real risk for this advisory committee is that whatever outcomes you seek is that you own those outcomes. Once you do that, you've given permission to the rest of the community to kind of fold their arms and say, well, let us know when you get there. The secret of the community leadership is how do I engage that broader community to own the outcomes? That it's the community that gets to your solution, not you that get to the solution. Powerful transference of ownership. And I'll go down to that third line, is that in that hierarchical model, in that model of traditional advisory groups, there was tremendous value placed on having the right answer. Most people in corner offices got there because they had the right answer. The key to successful community outcomes is what's the right question? What's the right outcome? What's the right thing that we're trying to accomplish? Not the silver bullet. All those programs that were in those boxes in Rochester, Minnesota were right answers. But Rochester, Minnesota never got, no matter how much money they put, more than a third of their children through kindergarten ready until they start asking the right questions. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And the last thing I was going to point out on this slide is that oftentimes advisory groups think of them as controlling the binder, right? If we put everything in that binder, that will tell us what that strategic plan is going to look like. What this advisory group needs to be more focused on is how can we help and support that community to get to those outcomes. That's a much different role than owning the binder. Think of all of the binders for other initiatives that are on the back of our credenzas collecting dust. This is not about owning the binder. This is not about the strategy paragraph 4, subchapter 3. This is about how do you engage and enrich the community to achieve its outcome, and you are a catalyst to be able to do that. So Liz. I'm not going to go through all of these because I think these are things that we've talked about. It has to be broad in scope, need to be cross-sectoral, but I want to look at specifically point number 4. And we talked about ownership as a community as a whole. What I have found, whether it was at the National Hunger Summit, whether it was that work out in Nebraska, other communities around hunger, there is a key issue within communities in terms of, well, why should we continue to give money to those folks? There's this key sense, there's almost this dynamism, this friction within the community in terms of why don't they just help themselves? And so a powerful way that communities have been able to achieve that kind of working on that same movie is understanding that becoming hunger-free is also about independence. Is when I'm hunger-free, there are things that I can positively do to contribute to my community. If I'm always hungry, if I'm always worried about that next meal, oftentimes I can't achieve in schools, and we know the research about that. Oftentimes I can't maintain the work, we know the research about that. So I create ongoing dependence within a community. So if you were the person or the part of that community that says, we don't want to continue to create dependence, one of the most powerful ways you can do that is create a hunger-free community. That's a powerful switch in mindset that allows you to have your conversation at a place that isn't about how do we oppose each other in our strategies, but how do we get to a shared solution. So I think that's an important message for an advisory committee to think about. I think we have one last slide. And I just wanted to, main thing I wanted to put up there is our website and encourage the advisory group to visit that website or drop me an email or whatever, because a lot of examples, not only in the hunger space, but in other things of how communities have come together to achieve those solutions are there on that website. So that was the real quick overview. Susan, I hope we touched the bases that you wanted, and we'll have a conversation in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
So we're going to actually take this whole conversation to another level of depth right now. In our last research team meeting, we asked all of our hardworking researchers who meet every month, what do you think the key challenges of this project are right now? In other words, if we're going to meet our goals, what do we need to figure out how to do? And a lot of those, you'll see a lot of connection with the kinds of things Jay was talking about. So go ahead to the next slide, but just click once. So we have a blank slide here for a second. I had two choices in presenting these. One was to kind of synthesize them and give you the three, but I decided to let the voices of our researchers come through. So I'm going to read you a bulleted list of like 10 or 12 things. But before I do that, I just want to piggyback on what Jay just said about dependence, because on this first slide, when we go through it, you'll see there's a lot of things in here about stakeholder engagement, and there's also a lot of things about analysis, like understanding what it is that we're trying to do.